Hello and welcome to this video. And on this video, I will be interviewing the incredible Roy Marchbank. Recently, I did a couple of videos on Roy after seeing him online. I thought not only was he incredible technically, but what was far more interesting for me was the fact that he seemed like an original, right? He seemed like an individual, and that's always what gets me most excited about music. Through doing those videos, I've actually made friends with Roy, and last Sunday Roy came down here close to where I live, and we got into a local venue. We brought an audience in and we improvised some music for that audience, which is an incredible experience, and we're hoping to do some more stuff in the future. In a minute I'm going to show you some video from that masterclass that we did. It's just filmed on an iPhone or a phone. I shouldn't be advertising, should I? It's filmed on a mobile phone, smartphone, and the quality is not fantastic, but it will give you an idea of what happened last Sunday, which might be interesting for some of you. And then following on from that will be the interview with Roy. So I hope you enjoy it. I just checked the video back, and there is like a noise on the video. I think there was a fan running in Roy's house when we were filming it. So there's a noise on that. So if you can, we did try and get rid of it. We weren't too sure what it was, but it is there. So if you can work around that, I think you'll find it really interesting, and you'll see the hidden depths that this guy has got. So, which is so much more than just an incredible technician, and he hopefully will explain a little bit about how he developed this technique and where it comes from, which I hope will be very interesting. And we talk about a whole bunch of interesting musicians, including Frank Gambale, and we talk about Gary Moore, and we talk about Stanley Jordan. So anyway, here we go. Sit back and relax, and we're going to start off, take you back to 45 Live in Kidderminster, in front of an audience of my students, playing some pretty insane music. Here we go. Hello there, Roy. How are you, my mate?
Yeah, very well, thank you, Andy. All good.
Got over Sunday yet?
Sorry, again?
Have you got over Sunday yet?
Yeah, just about back home, settled back into family life and everything else that has to happen in my world, recording and yeah. So yeah, settled back in. Looking forward to the next visit, but yeah, happy days.
For those of you watching, me and Roy got together for the first time and we jammed up in front of an audience, and it was very, very exciting. But I think we'll come to that later on. Roy, you're known for sort of really extreme jaw-dropping technique on the guitar, and that's pretty much how I came across. You know, someone mentioned you online, and I had to check you out, and you did seem to be getting almost like a backlash against the fact that you were playing so technically incredible stuff. So I sort of was going, no, this is really, because I saw other things apart from just the sheer speed and virtuosity. There was a really interesting application of like different techniques, microtones, bends, in really interesting phrasing. You really explored guitar tone deeply. And so that's all quite perplexing. So can we go right back to when you started? How did you start playing, and how did you develop this technique?
Yeah, well, I got my first guitar when I was 3 years old. It was one of those kind of, the catalogue jobs that you used to get, just dreadful, unplayable children's guitar, but I loved the instrument, I loved the sound of it. And my father went offshore and left the guitar in the corner of the room, and he'd been going for some guitar lessons, so I was quite intrigued with the sound. And at that time, back in the early 70s, it was pretty much the album collection that my parents had that was left for me to go through. In fact, I didn't even have a record player. I listened to a lot of the albums on a gramophone and destroyed all the records, so I didn't know any different. But they did have a cassette recording, and this old cassette machine. So the recording was from the lessons my father had done, and on this recording was a track by Big Bill Broonzy called Guitar Shuffle. And I had the tablature in the book. Of course, I didn't know how to read tablature, and there was nobody around at the time. So I went about trying to persevere to understand what was going on there. And as soon as I hit that G7 chord and I had that rhythmic pulse that was quite bluesy, it was so infectious. I didn't understand it, and even now it's a magical thing. But basically, that was the magic it kicked off. And when I first played that chord, and I could make sense of what was on the written page with what I was listening to on that cassette tape. So the bug set in there, and I knew immediately from that very moment, I was going to be doing this for the rest of my life, and everything else was going to be taking a back seat. I have done other things, of course, but music primarily is, the love of my life, so it's a case of that was going to be centre of everything I would do from that moment onwards. So yeah, 10 years old, I got really serious into it. Started out listening to, as we all did back then, Van Halen, Gary Moore, Leonard Skinner, all the Deep Purple. Got really into all that side of the rock side of things. But another side.
What were the guitarists at that point that you were really into, right, starting off?
Yeah, well,
one in particular.
Not really at that point, because there was so much going on, and they all seemed incredible to me, and I didn't really know that much. I wasn't really too aware of what was super amazing, and like now you can tell the difference as with more years of experience you have, you can understand what extremes are in technique and what are. But back then it was just all music, so it was a case of just submerging myself into this wall of sound that I was listening to through my parents' albums. And also at that point, by 10, 11 years old, I was buying my own albums and borrowing my mates' albums as well. So the main players at that point when I was growing up was Gary Moore, Angus Young, Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen, Billy Gibbons. I'm trying to think if there was Alan Collins was a huge hero of Leonard Skinner. Steve Gaines of Leonard Skinner, obviously all the guys in Skinner, you know. A lot of the blues guys that I was into back then, I suppose like Jeff Beck was taking a back seat. I didn't really get into Jeff Beck until much later on, because I was more into Jimmy Page and some of the really old blues guys like John Lee Hooker, and I hadn't even heard of Stevie Ray Vaughan. But Clapton was around in the periphery. But I wasn't really into the blues until much later as well. So it became the ragtime thing, and traditional music seemed to be taking initially a more dominant position, and a lot of classical music as well, because my next door neighbour was a huge classical freak, and he was always bugging me about Andrew Segovia and not being able to play well Recuerdos de la Alhambra. So that really pushed me into the PMAC technique, right hand technique, and classical work as well. So all the grounding, all the basics were well and truly covered by the time I was 15, 16. But I had no formal training, I had no education as such, certainly not any training and education in anything harmony-wise and jazz harmony. It was all done by ear, because really I was living in the middle of nowhere, and the educational sources back then were basically the local guitar hero down at the pub, and you weren't even allowed to go into the pub, and because I was too young to go and see anything that was remotely more musical than what I was listening to round about the local folk scene. So yeah, my formal training, my early training was basically that, and then obviously subsequently I went to a music college in 1988, and I auditioned for a music college in Perth in Scotland. Got a position for a couple of years, and what that did was basically it took me out of what would have probably ended up being was it would have been a car mechanic. It took me out of that. It gave my dreams a hope, you know, and I was ever so grateful because of that, and to be able to sit and learn from these other musicians, and being in the environment as well, and being able to record and experiment, writing and everything else that came with it. So by the time I'd left, I was already in a pretty powerful position to hold my own when it came to a session. And of course the session work, as you know yourself, is a whole different ballgame. You don't really know until you're tried and all that. So I was fortunate enough to get to Ireland. I joined a band in 92, I think, and from 92 to 97 I was in Ireland, working in basically theatres, doing shows, theatre pit shows. So you had to have your chord chart there. Your reading had to be good, because you'd get the music, there'd be 16 tracks to be able to play the next day, and you had to be on the ball, and your chart reading had to be good enough to be able to follow what everybody else was doing, and all the other guys were real heads, they were real pros. So yeah, that was a real kick up the pants when I got across there, a bit of a shake up. But yeah, that was my bread and butter. And if it wasn't for the music college, I don't think any of that would have happened. And anything subsequently after that, I'd probably still be a car mechanic, very frustrated, very unhappy, and shaking the face.
Were you so you were studying all sorts of guitar technique? We're not just talking old step picking and legato. You were looking at classical technique, fingerstyle technique. What sorts of things you'd had quite a broad experience, and then music college really put the harmonics knowledge in.
Yeah. Basically, that's how it went. Yeah.
Did you get introduced to any players at music college that sort of? I mean, when did you come across, say, the guitarists that have influenced us all, like Alan Holdsworth, John McLaughlin,
right,
Jordan, Ingrid Malmsteen? When did that happen?
Well, that was all pre-music college. I was really into that, so I had all the Varney stuff obviously at my disposal. I had gone through Malmsteen was obviously on the scene, and he'd just broke into was playing with Alcatraz at the time. That was the first time I saw him playing the guitar solo for Hiroshima Mon Amour, and that had a bit of an effect, to say the least, because nobody else was playing like that on the scene at the time. But really what was hitting me harder was a lot of what John McLaughlin, Paco de Lucia and Aldo Mala was doing on the Friday night at San Francisco. And I had no way in being able to access how to be able to go about learning that way of playing to that level. All the stuff that was happening in the rock side of things was far, but I mean the music itself, it was really the guts of what the music was. I was more interested in the compositional side as well as the technique. What it was sitting on. How do you write that harmonically advanced and still have it so melodic? So I knew that I had to get out basically where I was staying. But initially all the guitar players, I had all the albums, you know, Steve Morse, Malmsteen, Jerry Donahue, of course Stanley Jordan. I'd listened to the great Lenny Brow and Tal Farlow, Les Paul, all these guys that I'd heard about, but I had no way in being able to try to decant what they were all about into a cup that I could drink, so I could understand harmonically how to put that into a concept, which was incredibly frustrating until the REH tuitional video series came out, and that was a whole different learning curve. And even although I bought all the tuitional stuff that I wanted to learn, the Danny Gatton stuff, and obviously Frank Gambale, I still wasn't playing like that. I discovered that I had my own sound, but I really wanted to try to develop that side of my playing, as opposed to being a carbon copy of anyone else. So it was really important for me to try to nurture that side and not to get too bogged down with what everybody else was amazing at, and trying to put myself into the picture. So the big changing point for me, I think we had this discussion before, I'd gone down to see Chick Corea Electric Band. I just turned 20, and 21 I saw the amazing Stanley Jordan, and that was just one of those moments where you step out of the concert and you decide, are you going to continue going down this road or not? Because it kind of opened the door to all these things that it was almost like Pandora's box was right there in front of me. So harmonically and musically and everything, what he was doing in a trio was basically there. But I just decided that then I'm going to have to find the courage to go forward and try and find a way to build on my own technique and repertoire. So basically that's what I've been doing ever since. Yeah.
It'd be good to chat about Stanley Jordan, because you know, on my channel we talk a lot about jazz fusion.
Yeah.
Get into the top 20 biggest selling jazz albums in history, like multi-million selling albums. There's only a few, and the Stanley Jordan album is one of them. It sold millions, and he really crossed over. I mean, I can remember seeing him from the Tube in the UK doing Eleanor Rigby. But he doesn't get mentioned. He doesn't seem to get mentioned in the same breath as a Holdsworth or a Sean Lane or a Gambale. And it's almost like he was so incredible that people have just got compartmentalised. But what he did was, I can remember watching him. The tapping thing was one thing. The thing that blew me away was the harmony.
Yeah.
He seemed to understand like that, almost like Coltrane harmony, in the way Roy Tyner would build those sort of chordal harmonic chords on, and he got so much compositional ideas all in the one instrument. And talking to you now, I think what's really interesting is the role that composition played. It sounds like what was driving you really was not, I want to be the best guitarist in the world, play all these techniques. It was, how do I get the techniques to be able to play the things that I've got in my head, you know? And I think that's
exactly. Well, the one thing that really,
with virtuoso musicians, so often they're driven not to be virtuoso, they're driven to play the things or discover something they haven't heard. I think that's the other thing, isn't it?
That's exactly it. When I first came across something that was technically challenging, I was 3 years old. I was listening to, obviously, the amazing Milt Franklin and what he was doing with an orchestra with basically cartoons that had no dialogue. And I remember the first time that I really clicked with my dad. It was one of those father-son moments where we both laughed at the same thing, but there was no dialogue. So I'm 3 years old and I'm watching this. Then I started to think, well, what's doing that apart from the movement and the fact that the movements in the cartoon's funny? But when the sound was down, nothing was really going on, and the sound's on. It's like, so it's all to do with the sound. So how do you do that? and you're hearing like the violins going like the barrels of hell. But some of the stuff that I'm playing isn't so much like something that's really new musically. They were doing it all the way back then, and 2, 3, 4, God knows how many hundreds of years
Are you
ago.
talking about like Tom and Jerry, Roadrunner?
Yeah. Roadrunner, especially Roadrunner. Roadrunner was the thing, the key moment that actually had that father-son connection. It was like bam, we're both laughing at the same thing. We both find that funny, and it was amazing how they managed to do it. So that became something that I was acutely aware of happening in music that was important. And when I started hearing these flurries of notes, I thought, oh, that's just for violin. I never thought for a second that it would be even remotely possible, something like that in the guitar when I was that young, because it was just presented on a violin, so that's what violins do. And this is what piano does. Everything else had its place. But it planted the seed as to how important music is for movement, and how to describe what music actually is trying to do, is paint the scene or the picture. So that became the fuel for me to start questioning absolutely everything about it, everything about music. It was just one magic, happy place that I could, disappear into, and I didn't have a clue about it. And as the years progressed, I suddenly go, oh right, this is how the jigsaw puzzle's put together. I understand how that works now. But even now, I find myself looking at and listening to some music and thinking, how does that work? Especially when you travel to foreign countries and you start to appreciate culture and where they're coming from, and how they decorate notes and how they play ornamentals, and it's a whole different scene again.
But I think this is something that people don't understand about you, is how much you've researched into different world music systems, especially string instruments, not just guitar, but string instruments. And you've travelled the world literally right to the deep corners. Can you tell us a little about, where you've gone and what you did and how that influenced you?
Well, the first thing that really hit home with me is when I went to Ireland, and I really started to knuckle down and appreciate how traditional music functioned, what it was, what was good, what was considered good, and what was considered groundbreaking. And I remember when Riverdance came out, I started to question, well, who wrote this music and where does it come from? And I saw my friend had bought this album, Eastwind, by Davy Spillane. And there was this guy that had travelled the Macedonian mountains, and he'd come back with all this music that was written in 1716 time, and I was like, what's happening here? So when I started to see how that was influencing traditional music that had basically stayed the same for hundreds of years, that really fascinated me, and I thought, so they've basically taken this idea, added it to Riverdance. It's blowing, it just went ballistic because it was so fresh and new, and to this day in many ways it's fresh and new. That was the first thing that I felt was necessary to try and comprehend. So from there, when I went on tour, we travelled all around Europe, into Central Asia, all the stands, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and all those areas, and travelling through them and meeting the people and the musicians that they were playing instruments that were basically thousands of years old. Well, the instruments weren't, but they were reproductions of instruments that were thousands of years old, and they were playing them amazingly. So that was the next huge development for me, to start to question how I could interpret what they were doing into something that I could comprehend in my own little box of tricks.
You described the sort of things you saw, what because not many, we're all influenced by Gary Moore and Malmsteen, but what did you see specifically that they were doing on the instrument?
Yeah, I think what really stood out for me, and what was really cool about it, was they were all individually completely different. None of them were a carbon copy of each other in any way, shape or form. They all had their own thing going on. And that's when I started to appreciate just how important it was to be an original, just to be yourself and to cultivate what comes to you naturally, what comes to you that you really want to do, and to make that part of everything you do from from then till now. It was one of those things that I realised it was the most important thing musically. Was to do what Pat Metheny basically said was, you know, it was considered uncool to basically be a copy of any of these guys. But what I appreciated about Gary Moore was his drive, his feel, the passion that he played with, and all the other guys had their own things going on as well. Like Brian May had his, like, you know, that amazing tone. That was the first time that I'd actually, if I focused on sound, was Billy Gibbons and Brian May. And I could hear all the qualities of the pinched harmonics and Gibbons playing, all these little, you know, these quirky ways and how you could play with just one note. And from Brian May, it was a case of just the sheer beauty of a sound, of an overdriven sound. So I realised that these things were key components to try and putting my own thing together. But I also realised that although I could copy them and I could go and, you know, buy all the same gear, I would never sound like them. But I didn't want to sound like them as far as like how it was all composed and put together. So for me, it was I was trying to follow the sound in my head, and in a lot of ways I still am. And that's why really from a day-to-day basis, and certainly over the course of like every 10 years, I'll sound completely different from one week to the next. And I think that kind of throws people as well. Oh, he doesn't sound the same here, or this was different. But it's because my imagination is so active, and because I'm trying to fine hone what I'm hearing in my mind's eye, I couldn't care less if I sound anything remotely like I sounded yesterday. I'm just chasing this new thing that's happening. It's like everybody is a musician that knows how to compose. There is a part of that creative picture, understands it's just like having your antennas out, and you're listening for these sounds, and you either listen with what's inside you, or you listen with your ears. But mostly the sound that I hear, if I just sit in silence and there's no other sound, it all just comes to me all at once. And that's what I'm trying to get to all the time. And that's why it's different all the time. It's never the same with me. You know, I know it really throws people, but that's really where I'm coming from. So all these other guys, through time, Eddie Van Halen had his own thing going on, and all of them had their own unique thing because they believed in that, and they were all a part of the same picture. It's just that I didn't realise that when I was younger. And it took me up until, as I say, like to about 25 years old, until I started to go, yeah, I shouldn't be worrying about this. It's actually something that's already built in, and it's built into each and every one of us, so it's not really something people should feel bad. Oh, I don't have my sound. Oh, I can't do this. We're all unique, you know. We've all got something to say, so, yeah.
But I was very lucky to meet up with Mark Mondazia. He's one of my favourite drummers, one of the greatest drummers on the planet, I believe, really doing it. And he messaged me because he watched the channel, which was a real honour. I went to see him, and he said something that's really interesting to me. He goes, there's musicians who are great stylists, and then there are musicians who are originators.
Uh-huh.
And he says someone like Tony Williams is on the drums is an originator, where someone like Vinnie Colaiuta is a great stylist. So what he means is that you look at Vinnie, you can hear Tony in it, and you can hear Steve Gadd in there. But when you hear Williams, you go, well, where the hell's this coming from? I think Alan Holdsworth's like that. It's always a shock.
Oh.
It's not anyone who gets bogged down just with the sheer technical proficiency of him. They don't get it.
Yeah.
Holdsworth,
totally.
I think all that has happened because he's originated something that's all him. Of course, he hated the copying thing, and so often, and I
totally understand.
Chatting about this with Mark, so often someone will say, check this guitar player out, and I listen to her and I go, yeah, they're great, they're fantastic, but it's like they're ticking boxes. They can do this, they can do that, they do that really well, that's really tasty. Now they're going to do this tapping thing, that's really cool. But the thing that draws me to musicians, me personally, is when I'm slightly dumbfounded by it because I've not heard it before, and I think that puts people off to start off with. I think Holdsworth suffered with this.
I think they all did.
Suffered with this. They've now been turned into almost like gods, haven't they? But And this is what drew me to you, you know, was the fact that there was part of it that I didn't understand, you know, but why is he playing so fast? You know, how do you deal, how does that work, you know, aesthetically? What pushed you to push the limits, you know?
The first time I heard Art Tatum playing piano, I think it was around about 24, and I was always trying to be as good a player as I could be up until I was that age. I wasn't really too pushed about. I mean, speed was important, but not to any. I was more interested in being an all-rounded player, a session guy that could work and play with anyone. That was my main priority, was to be able to pick up an acoustic in any genre, have my rigs for different genres so I could go and do the work and be as good at that as possible. And I had varying degrees of success with each one, some better than others. But the thing that really kicked it to life for me was, I mean, I'd obviously heard of Paganini, and I'd been studying some of Paganini's stuff for quite some time. But the thing that triggered it was listening to Art Tatum's lines. And because I'd listened, when I got into Tatum, I got onto Charlie Parker. And when I got into Charlie Parker, it just spun out into all the old guys, you know, Buddy DeFranco and all the great jazz players. And it wasn't really guitarists that I was interested in, because the sound of the guitar for me isn't something, and it sounds bizarre to say it because I love the instrument, but the sound of it for me wasn't right for me. I wanted to change it in some way where it was more effective, like say a clarinet, a saxophone, a violin, something that had the dynamic range where I felt I was more in control of it, which is now, thankfully, in the last year, present day, I'm really happy about that. But it was all the old jazz guys that really started to stick out at me. And I bought, as I say, the Gambale thing. I suppose Gambale was the one that planted the seeds for all this happening, because I could hear the beauty of the lines that he was playing was very similar to that. And I was like, well, where's this coming from? And now I can understand, because as anybody knows, if you're watching any Gambale's tuitional material, it's probably the best that you can buy. It's just so thorough. You understand how the jigsaw is put together. So that immediately put me onto all the other guys. It was like, oh, this whole world just started to blossom and open up to me. I'm like, man, right, okay, I'm starting to understand the logic behind this now. My ear was starting to twig to the nuances, not just of jazz.
I don't think Gambale gets the credit. Again, it's when someone pushes a technique so far.
Oh, it's so annoying. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think you have to be dead to actually get that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's sad, because like you've got practically one of the greatest guitar geniuses that's ever lived right here. He's still alive.
Yeah.
And you have, there's another guy, Scotty Anderson. You never hear about this Scotty either. I mean, other guitarists talk about him, but nobody really talks about Scotty's playing, who's just phenomenal.
Yeah, I never heard of him until you introduced me to him.
And I mean, wow.
This guy's playing as fast as you. It's like nobody's mentioned that, you know, in a completely different genre, you know. So,
yeah.
Talking about sound and tone and wanting to play like a jazz musician, bring us right up to date, because we're in the last 10 minutes of this interview now. So
right.
Well, actually, we've got 6 minutes left, so
we're better
on my Zoom call. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now.
Yeah, well, at the moment I've started to get my head round about all this new MIDI gear, MIDI Guitar 2, which is fantastic because we've got the tech mouth controller, breath control, so it allows me the same dynamic range as say a sax or a violin, and without having to use a volume control, I'm actually controlling what a pick would essentially do with the breath controller. So it's mostly all left-hand work, which suits me fine because it means that I can use the pick for the acoustic stuff, which I believe also sounds better on an acoustic than it does on electric. So basically that's the road I'm going down at the moment, and utilising all the sample here from audio modelling through the MIDI Guitar 2 rig, which I brought down to the Kidderminster masterclass, which was fantastic, by the way. So that's really the trajectory I am on. That's where I'll be going on for some time. I can't see me ever getting off, because it was actually the most inspiring two things happened. It was the most inspiring actually discovering the gear and making and discovering it actually worked, and having that at my disposal for the dynamic range, but also playing with you guys and getting down there and hearing it for the first time in a live setting, because you don't really know if it's going to work or not until you start playing in front of people and with other musicians. And it did, and I was like, so I had the biggest grin. It was one of the happiest moments. So that's the trajectory I'm on at the moment. That's where we're going to be
I'm
going.
really looking forward to doing some more stuff for you. You know, I've spent like 40 years, you know, getting ready to play something like this. You know, that I've never really, you know, so watching back the video, and there'll be a bit of video on this from the gig. I'll put a little bit up. You know, we are just going for it. You know, I just thought, it's like years of just pent up frustration that flooded out. It was incredible, you know.
Yeah, but it was basically that. I mean, that was the first time I've actually let loose, I think probably in about 20 years, because any other time I've been playing is with sessions. And of course, the recording that I had on with, I'd finished just with At My Nar, which I'm really delighted with the new album. I'm really happy with that. It's probably the best recorded
but I told you something would go wrong, and it has, because Mo, my dog, he's got to come in.
Oh!
Is he here?
Is he?
Come on, Mojo, it's all right. My dog had to come in. But I think
that's no problem.
I think this is about the time. I think we should leave it here.
Yeah.
We should maybe do another one in a few weeks' time, you know, so we don't end up doing 2 hours of chatting, because I think...
Yeah, sounds good, Andy.
It's lovely to chat to you, Roy. And
likewise.
Soon, and we'll be playing again soon. And
that's right.
Here's to some more, you know, music making. And
yes, sir.
I'm now going to try and stop this, which I never know how to do. Anyway, I'm going to try and stop it now. Here we go.